All right, should we get started? A few things today. Let's see the agenda. We're going to talk about Ceph Daemon and SSH Orchestrator. Then Igor's going to talk about Blue Store, and then Jeff's going to go over the auto recovery behavior that's new in the kernel client. All right, can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. Let's start with Ceph Daemon tool and the SSH orchestrator. So the idea here was to basically try to capture capture the logic that's needed to correctly run a Ceph daemon in a container on just a regular host and wrap that up in a script. Ceph Ansible is already sort of doing this in its own way, where if you run it in the container mode, then instead of starting the daemon as a regular systemd unit, the systemd unit will basically run a container that runs the daemon. So this does roughly the same thing, but it has a few differences. It only knows how to use Podman. It doesn't use Docker, although we could add that, I think, without much trouble. It's not that different. And it has a different directory layout on the host, which I'll get to in a second. But basically, you can run cepdaemon tool, and it will create a container for you with all the right parameters, and then create a systemd unit that runs that container to start up the Ceph daemon. The other sort of important thing that it does is it has a bootstrap function, which lets you create a new Ceph cluster. So if you run here in the here in the Etherpad, if you're looking, I haven't really thought about this carefully, but this is a sample like bare bones workflow for how to create a new Ceph cluster. You would basically just grab the script in whatever form. It's written in Python, but it's written to have no dependencies, no external library, so it's just one file, and not to use any unusual or weird language features. So you just download the script, run bootstrap, tell it what the monitor IP it should bind to, and where to write the keyring and conf, and it'll create a monitor and a manager on the local host and start them up, and then it'll give you your keyring and ceph.conf file. So assuming you actually want to use those on the current host, if you have the clients installed, then you could copy those to netcceph, or you can run them, copy them somewhere else, whatever you want to do. But that just like gets a cluster up and running. And the goal then is to be able to do everything else that you would ever have to do to deploy the cluster using the orchestrator as, quote unquote day two operations, like adding any additional monitors, adding OSDs, adding metadata servers, Redis gateways, whatever it is, through the CLI or through the dashboard. So all this, everything here beyond that bootstrap part could additionally be done through the dashboard if once the dashboard knows how to do that. But this workflow basically works in this pull request here at the top. There's a script that I'm just running to test it over and over again, which basically bootstraps monitor and a manager. It adds another second monitor. It adds a second manager. It adds a couple metadata servers. It doesn't do the OSDs yet because it's slightly annoying to like clean up afterwards to rerun the script, but you could do that too. And so all that stuff is working. And so that pull request basically has all the Ceph daemon script changes, whatever the script, and then it all has a bunch of changes to the SSH orchestrator, which previously, when Noah worked on it, was written to do things like Ceph deployed, where it would just install the daemons on the bare metal host. This pull request basically changes it so that it does everything through the Ceph daemon tool. So instead of putting the data in varlib ceph OSD, whatever, and copying your config file to etc ceph, it uses a Ceph daemon, and so it will always install daemons using Podman and containers. So the assumption here is that starting with Octopus going forward, the one and only, or I don't know, not the only, but the way that the SSH orchestrator will work will just be, it'll only know how to run Ceph in containers, which is nice in that the whole thing, this pull request works. Like it does everything, almost everything. It basically is functional, but it doesn't have to know anything about different OS distributions, and it doesn't have to know anything about Debian and RPM and how to install packages and where to get packages from. Like all that stuff just goes away. That nightmare is finally ended, and instead you give it one string, which is the name of the container image. And Podman at least is smart. So if you do Ceph/daemon base default, that'll pull it from Docker Hub. But you can also pass it like a container name from the Quay registry that has all of our QA builds, and that also works. It's Ceph CI / Ceph base, daemon base, : and then whatever your branch tag string is. And Podman basically tries the Docker Hub. If it doesn't find it there, it tries something on Fedora. It doesn't find it there, it tries Quay. At least that's the behavior on my Fedora box. If it's in some other registry, if you want to pull it from somewhere else, I think you can do a fully specified URL or something in there. I'm not sure exactly how the image sources work, but basically it all reduces down to that one string. And so you can specify what image to run on a per daemon basis. You can do it. You can upgrade daemon by daemon without having to worry about all the other upgrading annoyances stuff that used to be a problem with using packages. So that part of it is so far really nice. The pull request introduces a Ceph config option called image. So and the SSH orchestrator pulls that out of the Ceph config database or whatever. So you can have a global property that's what container image to use for the whole cluster. You can customize it on a per daemon type or per daemon basis, just like you can with any other Ceph config option, and that will be the one that's used by the orchestrator when you can do it, when you deploy daemons and so on. So yeah, I think I'm pretty pleased that it's working after I've been working on it since like last Wednesday. And I think the Ceph daemon script is like reasonably complete. I think the SSH script the SSH orchestrator will do all the minimum stuff. It'll create monitors, managers, and OSDs. I think there's a whole lot we need to do to like clean up the overall experience and make it more responsive and make it friendlier. And the drive group stuff isn't there yet, so the OSD provisioning is super basic. So there's a lot to like improve on, but like the basics work and seem to work reasonably well. Any questions so far? I just keep rambling.
Sage, with containers, do you know, is there any plan for them to be able to use swap space anytime soon?
Swap space? I have no idea.
That's a problem that we've been running into a lot with the current like Rook stuff, is that you end up with the application data being swapped out basically instead of actual like swap data because there's no swap. So you can like the kernel can still like page out part of the application itself. So that ends up happening as opposed to swapping out, other memory, and it causes these huge like stall issues. As something I'm like.
So it's because it's swapping out part of the Ceph daemon, you mean?
Exactly. Yep. So okay. Part of the actual binary, right, is what gets swapped out. You want to disable swap. But you can't disable that. You can only, because you don't have swap, you don't swap out any of the actual like memory usage for things like, application data. It's actually the binary itself that is swapped because the kernel can do it because it doesn't have swap. That's the only thing it can do.
Weird. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's sort of unrelated to this stuff, but it is related from the standpoint that if we're like heading that direction for everything, it's something we've got to like figure out.
Yeah.
At some point here.
Yep.
The no swap thing is sort of a Kubernetes only limitation, right? I mean, there's no reason you couldn't run this thing outside Kubernetes and on a box that does have swap, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, this is intended to be used when you're not using Kubernetes. So a high level, big
Oh,
picture, the thinking is that we basically have two deployment modes. If you're in the Kubernetes world, then you'll use Rook and all that stuff. And the orchestrator, or the Ceph orchestrator API will talk to Rook to tell it to do stuff. And if you're not in Kubernetes land, then you're going to be in bare metal land, and then you'll use this. And this will replace Ansible and DeepC and Puppet and Ceph Deploy and all those like million other things. So if there's
how
like
do
a,
contain?
or,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
How do containers work in this? Sorry if I missed it earlier. What is it?
So what Ceph daemon does is it basically runs a container with Podman in sort of the right way. So it just creates a system. Here, let me show you. Let's see if I have it running right now. I don't. Let me run my test script. And I can just paste it to you. So once the cluster comes up, which takes 20 seconds maybe, then you see containers like this. You do podman ps. I'll do this in the pad. Podman ps looks like this, and system control status looks like, oops, control looks like this. So there's a Ceph unit called Ceph.target that it creates. So this is assuming, the assumption here is that there's nothing installed in the host, no packages, except that Podman is installed. Basically, that's the only that in Python works. So it creates a systemd unit called Ceph dash and then the UID for the cluster .target, which is all the daemons on that host for that particular cluster. And then it creates one for each daemon, managerx.service, mon.a.service, whatever it is. And there's also a Ceph.target, which is all Ceph clusters on the host, just so you can start and stop everything all together. And if you look at the actual systemd units, let me paste one of those. You look at the actual unit, it looks like this. And so really all the systemd unit does is this one line here where it runs. So the %i is the instance for that particular unit. So it's the daemon name. It runs a script called cmd, which is in the var libceph directory. And if you look at that, cat var libceph. For the monitor, for example, it's this. And it is just a script that runs podman to run the daemon inside the container. So it names the container, like you see up here at the top for the container names. It's Ceph-UID-daemon name. It passes all the right paths through so that it binds the data directories, the right locations inside the container. For OSDs and monitors, it gives you dev and udev and all that crap so they can access devices. For the stateless containers, it doesn't need that. And then inside the container, it just runs the daemon in the foreground, logging to standard error by default. Just like the traditional systemd units are. So that's basically it. You have a bare metal host, you get some system units that run the containers, and the container contains the daemon. Inside the container, it looks like a traditional Ceph install. Everything is in var log Ceph and var lib Ceph. Outside the container, things are organized a little bit differently so that you don't have to worry about multiple clusters colliding on the same host. So similar to what the Rook kind of does this too, where it puts things on the host in var lib Rook. It rings like every single time I'm on. Yeah, that's weird. Never any other time. Okay. So the paths look like this on the host. So basically, everything's just put in a subdirectory with the cluster UID, so they're separated. And then the daemon directories are simplified, so it's just type.id instead of type/ceph-id, which is sort of a stupid the way it used to work. But that's basically it. So there's also the Ceph daemon script has a list command that will just list all of these that it finds on the host, all the clusters and daemons it sees on the local host. And that is smart enough to look for the legacy style. So it'll look in varlib ceph OSD, sort of in the traditional layout, and it'll list them that say type equals legacy. The idea being that we can add a command to Ceph daemon that'll basically just convert from the old layout to the new layout. So if you say Ceph daemon convert OSD.0 or something like that, it'll just rename the old directories to the new directory layout, and then you can just start up a container with a legacy OSD in the new way. So it'll just be a simple one-by-one conversion of daemons from the old way to the new way. Does that make sense? So pretty simple. This is basically what Ansible is doing with its containers, except Ansible didn't reorganize things. So Ansible assumes that it's still varlog ceph and varlib ceph in the old layout, and etc ceph has the config. This layout basically doesn't have any, there's nothing in etc ceph at all, because again, we're assuming that there's nothing global, there's nothing installed on the host, and it puts the config file for each daemon inside that daemon's container. So in principle, they could be different for each one. And this config file is actually generated by the monitor command generate minimal conf. So it ordinarily is just going to have the FSID and the monitor IPs, and nothing else. So for the most part, you don't have to touch config files unless you want to customize something. You can just use the monitor configs. Definitely streamlined in that way. Right. So that's what it does so far. That pull request is a little bit wonky still because Remoto isn't running the script properly. It's like hard-coded with my source directory name because I need to do a little bit of refactoring. Alfredo's helping me get the Python stuff right. But it works, basic level. So let's see, Joshua, you're here. Len's mentioned that you were looking at changes to DeepC that is making it use Podman to run the daemons. I think the question was whether there's any like overlap or opportunity to like standardize on anything to be consistent across these two, or if it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so as you just rightly pointed out, we are also looking into Podman and trying to come up with our own way of doing things. This is all not settled, and I have to admit I have not looked into detail into the pull request yet, but I think this looks promising. So yeah, I at that point I can't really tell anything specific. I just know that we're doing similar things here, and it would be nice to
be consistent.
Right, to be consistent and also, to share the effort. But at that point, I can't really tell anything. I'll need to look into it more closely, and then probably the next meeting or next week somewhere I'll have something more.
That sounds great. Yeah, any feedback you can provide, you can poke me on IRC or on the pull request or whatever.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, long term, my hope is that we can take the sort of the fractured investment in DeepC and Ansible and Puppet and everything else and consolidate it on a sort of a canonical one way of doing things. So I'm hoping that this is that. If for some reason this is unable to do that, I'd love to hear why.
Yeah.
if we can fix that.
Essentially, we're doing the same things besides the thing where you XX start a file which holds the podman command. We just hard coded into the systemd file, but that's
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. The reason why I did it that way was so that there would be one unit file for all the daemons in a cluster, as the at thing that systemd does, where you parameterize the unit, it only has one argument, and so I wanted to make that argument enough to choose the thing, or whatever. Yeah.
Cool.
I think Ansible did it different. I think it did a totally differently named unit for every daemon, and it put the command in the unit file.
Right.
But this let me sort of avoid that. So there was only one unit file per cluster instead of one per daemon, I guess.
Yeah. No, this definitely looks very, very big, very cool and promising. And so I will follow up on that probably next week.
Cool. Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and I guess sort of independent of this, one of the goals is to teach this how to migrate to itself. So I mentioned that Ceph daemon list can recognize the legacy daemons. So we want to make it also do that for like when Rook does it, it deploys them in varlib Rook somewhere in some default location. We should teach it how to do that. So you could take a daemon that was deployed with Rook and adopt it, and you could do the same thing with the legacy ones. I don't know what, presumably like Puppet and DeepSea and everything previous to now have been doing it sort of the standardish way that Ceph deploy used to do it. So it'll all be the same in terms of how they adopt daemons. But if not, then we should make sure that it understands how to do that. And hopefully whatever new thing that you're working on with DeepSea is either same as it used to be, the legacy way, or maybe it's just the new way matches this, then that would be nice, so that there's one less variation in the wild of how things are deployed.
Do you think this would be feasible to use as part of a replacement for a vstart? Do we have the same kind of environment in a developer?
Almost. Yeah, so it almost is. The only gap is currently all the Ceph daemon stuff runs as root. There's probably possible to make it not require root, but when I run podman as a user and it tries to pull the image, it ends with an error, and I haven't looked at why. That wasn't really the use case I was focusing on, so I just ignored it. But in principle, if you could make podman run as root, then yes. And also you could do it so that you'd want to change it so we need to make the makefile have a make container that like will build from source container image on the local host that you can then use for the whole thing. Dan put some time into this a while back, and so he has something that sort of like mostly works. But it wasn't sort of completely wrapped up with a bow around it. So I think it has the potential to sort of increase your build times because you'd have to build enough of all the stuff so that you can build a complete image. Whereas when I use vstart, I don't build the MDS and Rados Gateway and some other stuff usually because I'm not testing those parts. So, but that's probably not that big a deal. You just have to do it once. But,
yeah, I guess you could even split out the different daemons into different containers potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, you can use different images also for different daemons. So you could have your custom, your like make image, local image used for whatever it is that you're testing, the monitor and the OSD maybe. And you could use the standard upstream or latest master build or whatever for the other daemons if you wanted to do that. But in the meantime, you can test the SSH orchestrator with vstart in this pull request. It'll basically. So one thing I didn't mention, there's so the last part of this bootstrap generates an SSH key, and it injects it into the cluster as the SSH identity used for the SSH orchestrator, and it appends it to the local root user's authorized keys, and then adds the local host to the host list or whatever for the SSH orchestrator. So the idea is that you run bootstrap, and then your next command can be like, and now deploying OSD, and now whatever, starting with the local host already ready to go, and you can build out from there. So it's easy to like seed a cluster and then go out. There's a optional flag to like skip that part if you don't want to actually do all the SSH key generation stuff, but that's currently what it does. And conversely, on vstart, it's mentioned here. If you pass dash SSH to vstart, it will enable the SSH orchestrator, inject the your current user's key, assumed to be tilde.ssh id rsa.pub or whatever. And it assumes that can SSH to root on the local host, so you can test or whatever, and then you can go from there. I might change that option a bit so it's a little bit more flexible, so you can specify like a different host maybe instead of localhost. But the idea basically is that if you just pass -ssh, you can test in your development copy the SSH orchestrator and start deploying other daemons. So in my tests, for example, I would when I was developing it, I would run vstart and then I would deploy an OSD using a bare metal disk on the local host, and it would create a pod just for that OSD. But it would be part of the cluster that my vstart cluster.
Cool, that's very exciting.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So longer term, like, do you envision this trying to be a very simple deployment, or trying to gather some more complexities around like setting the right memory and deploying the right number of OSDs per node, that kind of stuff that Rook does?
I think my goal is basically to replace Ceph deploy. So not necessarily super clever about where to put daemons or how many of them or whatever. My sense is that all of those sorts of decisions should be something that we layer on top of this in either the dashboard or in the manager or something like that. So for example, there's a whole drive groups discussion thing that's the orchestrator team has been working on for a long time, where you have a set of devices and there's the logic to like capture how many OSDs to create on each device and how to group them and how to divide the SSD up into pieces for all the hard disks, and all that stuff is sort of encapsulated. And so that would sort of layer on top of this. And so it would work. It would have the same flow whether you're using Rook or you're using this, as far as like deciding how to create OSDs. And hopefully eventually drive all that from the dashboard. So it'd be like point and click, whatever, add a host, list the devices, you check them all off and you say go, something like that.
Yeah, it'd be great to centralize that
the
logic.
workflow in the dashboard is currently under development. I've already seen previews.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yep, I'm totally behind on the drive group stuff. I haven't been following the discussions. Probably be helping with that next, I guess, because right now this orchestrator OSD create command is like the most trivial thing. You can only give it one device, it always deploys BlueStore, and it doesn't do anything else. You can tell that from the syntax. It's like super simple. But yeah, that would be the next step. And I know that I've had conversations with Erwan and Sebastian also about trying to, if you have like 10 hosts that all are supposed to have exactly 12 disks, this model or whatever, having a way that you can like describe that the way that you previously would do in Ceph Ansible, and it would have sort of the logic that looks at all the hosts and makes sure actually the devices are there that you say, and it all matches and all everything's good, and then if things look okay, then go out and deploy all the OSDs, that type of thing. That's something that you could build on top of this, or out of the drive group stuff. I haven't been following it, but again, that my hope is that whatever that sort of higher level planning workflow is, it would sit above the orchestrator interface. So it would be the same whether you are using Rook or you're using this. You could leverage the same sort of flows, I guess.
Sage, is there going to be any kind of like Python interface for interacting with this thing?
Only sort of. It's written to be a single script so that you can wget it. So it won't be like a nice wrapped library. That said, I think we are changing it so that it can also be run there's this stupid detail about how Remoto actually runs the remote script, because the script won't be on the remote host that you're going to go deploy stuff on. And so you either need to like copy the script and run it, or what we're probably actually going to do is Remoto can run Python code, local Python code on the remote host. So Remoto is basically just going to import the script and then call the main method with the right arguments.
Sure.
And so presumably the same sort of thing would be possible for another tool.
So right now we've got this really generic cluster class in CBT that really has very little in it. But one of the things I want to do is break out a lot of the stuff that's in the Ceph cluster class into a more generic Ceph kind of interface, so that CBT doesn't only just like set up all the daemons itself, but could potentially call out to other things like this, right? For doing the cluster configuration.
It would be awesome if CBT, for example, could just use this to deploy everything. One of the other things I didn't mention is that eventually I'd like to make a Ceph.py task replacement for Truthology that uses this to deploy daemons, to finally get away from the sort of the legacy Ceph task that Tommy dreamt up and deploys Ceph in its own weird, special, awkward, unique way. So that we have sort of end-to-end testing for at least this.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Getting the testing and the dev and actual deployment environment the same.
All the same, yeah.
I will say it is nice in some ways having a backup option though, because there were a couple of times where I was trying to do like, what was prior to Ceph deploy? What did we have before that?
Makes FFS.
Makes FFS.
Yeah, where it would break, and then I had to like have my own way to do it to actually keep running tests. So it's nice having like a couple options, but still make this the primary one that we use.
I think Ansible and DeepC and all the Puppet stuff, those aren't going to go away probably for a while, if ever even. But I think the nice thing about this is that my hope is that they can be complementary. So you could deploy a cluster with Ceph Ansible, for example, and it would do all the things. And then the very last step, it could basically just turn on the SSH orchestrator, and maybe it would distribute your SSH keys for you. Or you could do that manually, whatever. But then from there point forward, you could go through and you could migrate to this, and so all your day 2 operations could be done this way, for example. Although because I changed the file layout, it isn't the way that Ansible deploys daemons and this deploys daemons are different, so there'd be like a restart every daemon upgrade conversion process, I guess. But then you could, after that. But I mean, Ansible could do that, right? It could deploy the cluster and then convert it to use this and then walk away with the playbook. So I don't know.
The SSH orchestrator, is that something that can be easily by outside tools or other tools or other things?
I mean, it's part of manager module, so it's built into the Ceph command line. Right, so Ceph orchestrator ...
Oh,
so yeah, anything that you can use a Ceph CLI could use that to manage the cluster itself.
You can't use it in a generic way though for like just running arbitrary code, like arbitrary Python code somewhere else, like Remoto you said?
Yeah, Remoto would be what you want to use if you just want that part.
Yep.
Remoto.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the SSH orchestrator is like weirdly simple. It's only like 800 lines of code, and there's basically like it creates the Remoto connection. There's a helper for that. There's a helper that basically runs Ceph daemon with random arguments. And then there's like a create OSD method, a create manager one, and a create monitor one that are all slightly different because they create different key rings. And then they just run Ceph daemon, which is run via Remoto on the remote host. So it's pretty
sure.
It's not that many moving parts. It's pretty nice.
Yeah. So in CBT, that's all kind of just baked into the Ceph cluster class, but could really easily be done via this instead or something.
Yeah, it'd be great to do that. Just convert it to do this, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Right, that's all I got. Cool. Okay. The next topic is Blue Store. Igor, are you here?
Yeah. Hi.
Yep. All right. Hey.
So the general issue that I'd like to discuss is an efficiency in Blue Store that for when it keeps small objects. So due to pretty high allocation granularity, one might experience significant space loss when keeping such objects that are much less than the allocation granularity. I've seen several complaints about that, both from our customers and in mailing list. Also, recently we've got a PR trying to fix the same issue, so showing this visible issue for somebody.
Is it this one, 23208? Is that the one? It's from
well, actually, there is my PR, which pending for a while, and
from last year.
Just put into the chat two of them. The first one, well, the second one is mine, and the first one, one that recently appeared. I'm trying to solve the same issue. So both PRs doing well, trying to fix the issue by keeping small objects or small blobs in RocksDB instead of putting as a blob on main device. Also, I'd like to mention maybe related change that we are talking about for a while, which is reducing allocation granularity to probably 4K, which might make this issue less visible, at least.
Yeah.
So, well, the general question so far is how do you guys feel this issue is important? And maybe what are the ways, what do you think about the suggested ways of fixing that? What are the acceptance criteria to take this or that PR and things like that?
I think that even if we reduce the min-LX size to 4K, which it sounds like we're probably going to do, that this would be useful because there's still lots of people who put objects that are tiny, that are like 50 bytes or whatever.
Not to mention if you have a 4K object ECU over like 8+3 or something, it's even smaller.
Yeah. So I think it makes sense to solve this problem. If we do reduce the min-LX size, it does mean that the sort of the inline mode can worry about just really small stuff that's smaller than 4K, which might affect the design a little bit, although probably doesn't actually change anything. It seems like the primary question is if we are going to put that small object data in RocksDB, there are basically two places we could put it. It could either go inline in the O node directly, or it could go in some other part of the namespace. My intuition says that we should put it in some other part of the namespace so that the sort of the metadata portion of the key space doesn't get bloated and inflated. But if it's always under 4K, maybe that's less of a concern. I don't know. Be curious what you think there.
Are you worried about penalizing metadata scans?
Yeah.
One question I have regarding this that will kind of determine whether or not I think it's a good idea is how much write amplification are we going to see with this kind of data in RocksDB versus just going out to the 4K min-LX size anyway, right? Like if we're talking about
going to be space amplification.
Space. Well, and write amplification, but space amplification, both of them, right? In different ways.
So the RocksDB space amp is going to be like 2 to 3x. Is that right?
It depends on how many levels you have, because it could theoretically, a piece of data could be at every single level.
Yeah, it could be a
But
lot
it
more.
could.
But that's also only true so much if it's being rapidly updated, or if that part of the key space is rather. If it's a relatively static bit of data, then it'll be essentially nothing. Which I guess is the case for some RGW workloads.
Yeah.
It's probably a much higher write amp than space amp, depending on various things, but yeah.
I think the use case that comes to mind for this being important is people who use RGW to store lots of small objects.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so in that case, they're immutable. They're just a bazillion of them, and they're all small.
One question here about CephFS. Does it suffer from the same issue, or it's
Yeah, but I think usually when it's CephFS, when it's a file system, the rule of thumb where most files are small but most data lives in large files tends to hold. And so having the small files be slightly space inefficient isn't like a huge deal. Whereas I think with object stores, we keep seeing these users where like they have a cluster that's filled with a petabyte full of like, 12K objects or something like that. and then that doesn't really help. But I don't know. These are all just sort of.
Certainly, some trade-offs here with like space amplification, rate amplification, and performance. Like the more recent PR, the author posted some benchmarks showing it had much higher CPU utilization and memory use with this enabled. I think Igor had mentioned earlier the possibility of making this optional in some way.
With that Yang's pull request?
Yeah.
Recent one? Yeah, so that particular one is putting it in the O node. I just skimmed it, but I think it's putting it in the O node.
Yep.
And so it's going to affect the metadata access, and I think that's probably not what I would lean towards. But it does put a lower bound on like the latency that you expect. Get like a random small object, I guess, because you're going to have to look up the metadata, and then you're going to have to look up the data in a different location. So,
is it possible to have multiple RocksDB instances? Is it possible to have multiple RocksDB instances for various size ranges?
It is, but I think the better way to do it is to use the column families, so that you still retain the ability to have a transaction that covers all the column families, but the data is segregated into a different actual LSM tree after that. So that's what we're already doing to segregate OMAP data from ONode metadata from, I forget what else, bitmap allocation, I forget, and like the sharding stuff that Adam's working on, that shards RocksDB across a bunch of pieces, is doing that using column families. So it gives you basically almost all the benefits of having separate RocksDB instances, but it still pushes everything through the same write-ahead log, so you still get this atomic transaction behavior that makes everything really easy to reason about.
We perhaps may not need atomic transactions across various objects, right? They can be atomic on its own, but they don't have to happen atomically across multiple objects.
That's often the case, but it's not always the case, and so it's difficult to make that transition with BlueStore to have actual separate RocksDBs.
We did talk about doing it, but it was too hard,
we haven't.
Right?
Yeah. Basically, the contention, the problems that we see with BlueStar are mostly around the compaction and the CPU usage, and not around the bottleneck of the journal, mostly. And so, sort of gone that route for now. I think in this case, just having a separate column family for the small object data is probably sufficient. or possibly binning it by size if it matters. I don't know if it matters or not, but
I did want to bring up that whatever solution we look at, we probably should be testing it in conjunction with Adam's sharding work rather than looking at current.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, the potential roadmap to bring in this might be like wait for sharding stuff to land, then maybe make 4K allocation size for BlueStore, and finally implement inlining, object inlining.
I think that sounds right. I don't think you need to wait for those things to happen to develop this. I don't think it'll change the code. I doubt you'll see many conflicts. Because the sharding stuff, just my recollection is that it just changes it's mostly at the key value layer inside RocksDB. It doesn't change BlueStore all that much.
Mm-hmm.
So I think these are mostly orthogonal, I guess. Okay. But for performance testing, you'll probably want to test it on top of the sharding, definitely. Which I think is stable enough that you can probably develop on top of it right now anyway.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So I was skimming this newer pull request here, and one of the things I noticed is that the small object mode only supports like write full or something like that. So it's like I think that's something that we definitely don't want to do. Like I think you have to explicitly hint or something. I don't know. I'm just looking at the test at the bottom. But I think we want to make sure that it's fully general, so it's transparent to all the layers above.
Yeah, so the difference between my PR and this one is that my PR works on per blob level.
I
so
see. Okay.
I inline each blob separately, if possible, and this one requires immutable object and inlines object as a whole.
Okay. Yeah, doing a blob one probably makes sense because that way if you have a 4K plus 1 byte object, then
yeah, or you might have some sparse object or things like that. So it's definitely more flexible.
Yeah.
But more complex as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Okay, that's
all right.
what I have.
Sounds good to me. All right. Jeff, want to tell us about the auto recovery changes?
Sure. Patrick asked me to pop in and talk about it. So for the merge window for the kernel just closed this past week, and for 5.4 we went ahead and merged some patches that Zheng had done to add a new recover session mount option for KCFFS. And basically, what this does is it allows clients to auto recover from being blacklisted. So evidently, we have users that occasionally end up with blacklisted clients, and then having to go in and manually clear that up is a real pain for them. So what this does is we have two available modes right now. Here, let me paste in the documentation update into the chat.
Yeah, that'd be perfect.
I don't have any slides for this or anything, so
that's fine.
But essentially there are two modes currently. There's no and clean. And so no is the current method, basically where we don't really try to do any recovery. That's the default. But clean currently allows the client to automatically reconnect after it just detects that it's been blacklisted and unblacklisted. And so when it does that, what it does is it basically tosses out any cached writes it's got, sets write back errors on the thing. So when you call fsync, you'll see an error. Mm-hmm. You'll see if you have file locks, then you basically get an EIO on any activity for the file descriptor, or any read-write activity on the file descriptor until they are dropped and reacquired, or dropped at least. And so the idea is being that some of this behavior came from NFS, which actually does something similar when it loses state recovery. So if you are trying to recover locks after the server reboots and then that fails for whatever reason, and you can't get your lock back, then NFS will go in and start giving you errors on the file descriptors. And so we basically tried to emulate that behavior to as closely as we could here. So that's the basic thing. It's still a pretty bleeding edge feature. I'm not sure if we're going to deploy this out without some serious testing at this point. But I figured it was reasonable to go ahead and get it in and start playing with it. We also have a planned, maybe eventually adding a brute mode or something like that, brute force recovery, where it would basically make the client just try to soldier on as much as it can in the face of this. So, like if you had buffered writes, then you would go ahead and just flush them out after you recovered, and damn the torpedoes.
Yeah.
Full steam ahead. So in any case, we're still playing with this to try to see whether it's going to cause problems. If anybody wants to help test it out, that would be wonderful. And that's about all I got, really. I don't have a whole lot to talk about with it.
That sounds great. The clean behavior sounds like about the right. It's the most reasonable, safe thing because it lets the application detect. Hopefully, if it's paying attention, the application can tell something bad happens. And the fact that NFS is doing also is good.
We looked at doing like sig lost. I don't know if anybody's aware of it, but back in the POSIX or maybe AT&T Unix maybe had the ability to send a signal when you lost your lock for some reason, but we never implemented that in Linux. And I know Anna Schumacher looked at doing this for NFS, and it ended up not going with it because of that. And there was another thing I was going to mention too. Now I forgot what it was. Okay, never mind. So so anyway, that's it. So if you've got any, you want to help test it out, that'd be wonderful. Oh yeah, I mean, I guess I really kind of see this as being mostly useful on read-only configurations, right? Where this is the kind of thing where you really are looking at something where availability sort of trumps and data integrity. But if you're not doing writes, who cares, right? So you might as well just do reads, move on whenever the unblacklisting occurs. So anyway, that's all I got.
This topic actually came up a couple weeks ago when Doug and I were at CERN talking to them about their file stuff. They just have this general concern where they have, thousands of machines mounting a file system. And they want to avoid a situation at all costs where there's a blip on the file server and they have to go hunt down and reboot a bunch of client machines. In their case, it's like a batch computing environment or whatever. So if something happens, they'll kill the job and rerun it. So it's not that the integrity isn't such a big deal. They just don't want to have the headache of having to go mop up the mess at the end.
That case clean might be just what they need because
exactly.
It starts the IO errors and stuff like that.
Exactly
and
right.
It's possible too that you'd after being blacklisted, you'd end up being able to just block until you came back. And so if you caught it just right, you might even be able to keep soldiering on, even with the right. I think it's a useful feature. So we may have to tweak the approach to some in the future as we go because this is really pretty new stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Totally. Awesome. Okay. Anybody have any questions about that? Or anything else we should talk about? That's it for what was planned on the agenda. We've got plenty of time if we want to talk about anything else. We could check in really quick on the road to Nautilus, the octopus. I think we're doing pretty well. I've been watching the Trello board, and I think most of so octopus should be out in March. Hopefully at the beginning of March. The first or second week of March is when we're going to do Cephalcon. It'd be great to just like announce the release at the conference. Well, I think we'll announce it either way, but like actually have it out and installable at the same time. That would be fun. Which means a freeze around Christmas, New Year's. So that basically means we have October, November, December to finish things up. I've only been watching the Rados stuff. I think we're doing pretty well. There's some of these things in here that are like code cleanup that might not make it in time, but the major stuff that I was working on, at least, I think is mostly in. The sharding rocks DB is almost done. It sounds like Ceph top is making progress. I don't know. I'm not sure that these RBD. I think the RBD one's up to date. Yeah, I'm not sure about how these other features are going, but on the Rados front, I think we're doing okay. I think the big thing that sort of in my mind that I want to make sure gets finished up is the orchestration deployment bare metal, so that'll actually work in Octopus is my goal. I think, is there any other major stuff that we're doing that isn't on this list?
Sage, I have kind of a list of like performance low-hanging, well, not even low-hanging necessarily, but just like kind of important performance things I really am hoping to cover for Octopus. Like they're kind of broad across all of the different categories or different subsystems we have, but on the RGW side, we have stalls during bucket resharding. On the Ceph side, we have some of the MDS issues that with multi-MDS, but it sounds like Patrick's working on that for Octopus potentially. On RBD, we have a couple of other things that we're working on, I guess, that aren't maybe as critical. But just in general, it'd be really nice if, like, for Octopus, we could kind of get all of that stuff really smoothed out.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, the way to like track it is to put it on this Trello board. There is actually a performance card in here if you want to put them on there, or you can sprinkle them across the other components.
Yeah.
One way or the other.
It's a little tough, right? Because it kind of question of who owns it.
Yeah, right. Maybe we should talk about those in the performance call tomorrow. Do you like literally have a list that you could share?
Not written down, but I can make one.
Yeah, that'd be good. Do that. And then yeah, I think Jason's not here and Patrick's not here, so I'm not sure where RB and Ceph are. Casey, you're here. How are we doing for Rados Gateway?
Good on some fronts. Are you on the Trello? I don't have that open.
Yeah, I'm on it. I'm looking at it's in the chat. The second to the bottom. It's like dynamic resharding and multi-site per bucket replication Yehuda's working on. I think I'm optimistic that that'll be ready, but we'll see. It's like sort of banded. But there's other stuff like OMAP bypassing the GC logs. That one's
the
right?
The GC work is really close. Adam's async work is really close.
Okay. re-enable lifecycle expiration tests because they're disabled in Topology because of timing issues. That's one of them. Making the backend pluggable. This is like an open-ended thing for Zipper, so that's going to take like 3 releases probably. But maybe we'll have some initial parts of that merged.
Yeah, I think it'll be a while. Definitely not Octopus before we have something concrete like another backend that can do everything.
Yeah. What else? STS, Keystone, and Web Identity.
Not sure exactly what the status is there.
Or dynamic resharding in multi-site.
That one seems unlikely. There's a few things that have to happen first, and there might be a dependency on Yehuda's per bucket replication work there. Not quite sure yet.
Okay.
Casey, with some of the things that we've talked about on the performance front, would you want me to put those in the performance group on Trello here, or the performance grouping, or would that be better to have under the RGW heading, or just not on here yet, or what would you like to do?
I put it in RGW, I think, since it's ultimately RGW code.
Yeah, if there's something more general, then performance makes sense.
Sure.
We've internally been doing a lot of investigation around TC Malloc recently. Hopefully we'll have some results to share about that.
Should I add some of those things, or would you prefer to, or just not yet?
Well, what is there besides the non-pausing bucket reshard, which I don't think will be Octopus?
So that was one thing. Then there was also potentially reducing the amount of data that we have to decode in the CLS code, so that we're reducing the OSD CPU utilization for filtering.
Yeah, okay. Eric, I don't know if you've been following Eric's, he moved the filtering of delimiters down to the OSD.
Yep.
So that helps in cases that have prefix delimiter.
Yep. This was what we were talking about earlier, where we were talking about moving some of those things that we're filtering on outside of the entry, the directory entry, so that then you could just decode that as opposed to decoding the entire thing.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not sure that we came to a. I don't think we exactly reached a consensus there. Definitely there are performance improvements, but we want to find a clean way to get them.
Yep. And then let's see, beyond the pausing, then the other thing was the somehow making it so that we're not refetching the bucket index, like 1,000 entries from each shard for like a 1,000 entry listing, like a page from a bucket listing, right? Either via changing the hashing algorithm so that, we preserve order, or by doing something like Sage's idea, where we're, looking at the expected number of entries per shard that we need, and then like going back and fetching more or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a proposal that Eric had also, and
yep.
Yeah, I think he's been prioritizing the new index strategy, and that is on the Trello.
That is on the Trello? I must have missed it.
Yeah, it's RGW new bucket index strategy.
Oh, okay.
I thought that one was about changing the sharding scheme, but it was like adaptive or whatever.
It changes it so that it's naturally ordered instead of hash based, so that listing only has to read one shard at a time.
Okay. I think Mark's suggestion was without changing the sharding strategy, just if you have 10 shards and you're getting 1,000 entries, request like 200 from each shard instead of 1,000. And so you're 99.99% likely to get everything you need.
Definitely agree with that.
That might be a quicker. I don't know if the API is such that it allows, if you request 1,000, are you allowed to give back 99 or 990 or whatever and have it continue, or was that confuse clients?
And that it would confuse clients. The response is just a list of entries and then the marker for the next request.
Yeah, it will probably
There's no
confuse clients.
guarantee that.
No, I think there's an assumption that what you ask for, as long as it's under the limit, you should be getting the numbers of entries.
Yeah. Okay.
You could still like go back and fetch from Rados more if you really needed to, right? Like it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can make an assumption that.
Yeah, and we do that, right? We do that already.
Yehuda, I thought that we always grabbed like for a 1,000 entry page from a listing, we always grabbed 1,000 from every shard so that we were guaranteed to get 1,000.
I'm not sure we actually go fetch 1,000 from everyone, but we can probably, if we do, then reducing that number might be very, very trivial tweak because we already handle the merge there and fetch more
and loop. Yeah, because you could basically like divide by the number of shards times 2, and it would be almost always.
Yeah.
But since some of the filtering happens in RGW itself, we might filter out some of those and need to fetch more, and so there is logic to do that.
Well, it sounds like we should really easily be able to do this potentially.
Yeah, it's like 1 param or something like that. It might be.
I love the idea. Nobody has typed it yet.
Okay. I might take a shot at just doing that then. I want this.
I wouldn't be surprised if we just have a configurable that tells it how many entries to fetch.
There's some config about read ahead that I haven't ever quite understood. Maybe that's related.
Maybe. Need to look at the code.
If we have this piece there and it actually speeds things up the way that you'd hope that it would speed things up, it means that we could have a very high number of initial shards, and that would then make the pausing during bucket resharding less of an issue.
It'll still need to read from all the shards, right? So
I'll just read less.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I suspect that it's the asking a lot of shards is probably the bigger cost than like as getting a lot of entries from every shard.
Yeah, but there's some memory issue.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. But yes, definitely. That'd be good progress.
Also affects the Rados number of in-flight bytes and stuff like that. So
cluster bandwidth also.
I think we would also be doing decoding on those in the OSD for every single one for filtering, right? So we'd be redoing it over and over and over again.
That's correct.
Yep. All right. Anything else people want to throw out there?
were talking a little bit briefly about yesterday about scrubbing, polluting a booster cache. And you mentioned listing being a separate operation from statting later, so we need to pin things in the cache between those two. Would it be possible to make a combined list and stat operation?
Yeah, that might be good. Are you still here, Igor? Yes.
Yep.
So the goal was to make it so that when you do a scrub and we're listing and statting every node so that it doesn't pollute the cache. So the sort of the trivial way to do that would just be making it so that when you do the list or maybe when you do the get node or the stat or something, there's like a hint that says don't actually move this to the front of the LRU, just leave it where it is or put it at the bottom. But you'd have to make sure that it doesn't fall off, I guess. What would be the right thing? Because you just added, didn't you just do a pull request that makes it so that when you do a listing and you hint that you will need, that it will actually preload all the O nodes and leave them in the cache? Did that just get put in there?
Yeah, so there is a pending PR which implements something like that.
But if the only user for that is scrub, I wonder, or no, backfill I guess does it too. But I wonder if even better would be, for the scrub case, actually list and get the O nodes in one operation so that scrub can be careful, like not to keep it at the bottom of the LRU basically and give you a handle to it so that it's pinned. Probably more efficient. And it also would keep the cache pollution issues to a minimum. You know what I mean?
Need to think about that.
Yeah.
In RocksDB, they have like a concept of having different, like a low priority and a high priority pool in the cache. I wonder if we had some kind of segmented cache like that, if it would let us do things like this.
Yeah. Not in BlueStar. The MDS has a cache that's like that. It has multiple segments, low, middle, and high, I think. But
yeah.
But I think, I don't know how to think about it. But my guess is that if we made a collection list stat or plus or whatever function that would list and get O nodes all in one go, Scrub could use that, and BlueStar could implement it such that the O nodes are loaded, but at the very bottom of the LRU, so they'll go away as soon as you drop the reference, which I think would probably help quite a bit. Maybe I'll put that on the Trello board. Okay.
Maybe on the Trello board, I'll also add the changing the way that trimming works in the cache for the issue that we ran into recently.
Oh yeah, I would call that a bug actually. But
yeah. Okay.
Speaking of cache trimming, are there any other booster caches that have any kind of similar behavior?
Are there any other kind of booster caches?
Besides the O-node cache?
Oh.
Buffer cache does too.
Same.
But sort of, yeah, it's just, they're technically independent now, I guess, but they're more or less work the same way.
Yeah, we could double check. I'm not sure that you'd have quite the same behavior because on the things that would pollute the cache, like in the O-node case, it was Scrub that was polluting and pinning the items. And that doesn't really happen in the same way because the read stuff doesn't get pinned. Buffers don't get pinned unless they're right back, and usually wouldn't have right back at the bottom of the LRU. It'd be at the top. So I'm guessing you won't have the same problem.
if we have a little bit of time, Sage, I could tell you what I was doing in terms of the changing the way that we try to iterate through or look at pinned items in the cache for trimming. That's a valuable thing to talk about. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, we just have we have a few minutes. We can try to wrap this up at one. This is for the pinned items at the end of the cache, the owned cache.
Yeah. So initially, I had a patch that did kind of what you had mentioned when we had talked previously about just kind of mitigating things by looking at only contiguous pinned items rather than going through and looking at a certain number overall. And then also there was a couple other things I did in there that we had talked about. I don't remember what it was anymore, I guess, but just kind of mitigating it. But then we ended up deciding that with the particular issue that had been hit by the customer, just recommending increasing the number of pinned items as the short-term solution, or that you allow. So maybe a better long-term solution now, which is kind of what I'm looking at, is trying to do something similar to what the MDS does, where we have maintained like a separate list of maybe unpinned items, right? And you just walk through that directly rather than skipping over stuff.
Yep.
But then you have to maintain it by having like a callback or something, right? Where when something becomes pinned or unpinned, we maintain that separate list.
Yeah, I think that's the trick, because in the MDS, it's hooked into the get input reference count functions, and is hooked directly into the LRU code, and so it will actually move you out of the pinned tail list if you unpin it.
Yep.
You actually trim it, actually. I can't remember exactly what it does. But in this case, the LRU isn't structured that way, so we can't currently at least hook the reference count.
So the PR I was working on basically added a reference to the cache for the O node. So you have a reference to the cache, which then you could call into whenever that your reference count changes in a certain way to tell the cache that this is being pinned or unpinned, essentially.
Okay.
That was kind of what I was starting to play with, is going down that route.
Yeah, that might be sufficient. So that like if you have one reference and you're about to put, then you could just tell the cache, I'm about to drop my last reference, and the cache could move it out of the pinned tail to the tail.
Yep.
That would probably work. Yeah, that seems reasonable. I think the sort of the hacky workaround would be that the trimmer could just like do a circular like round robin pass over the pinned tail and just limit the amount of work it does every time. But that's always going to be less efficient than not having to do that, because you might still be iterating over a lot of pinned items and not getting anything done. So
yeah, I'd be nervous if a strategy that didn't have a guarantee, like a guaranteed bound in the log at some level.
Yeah, especially now that I think especially now that the trim is done inline. Even the current behavior will it might like iterate over 60 items and not get anything trimmed. Makes me very nervous, because
yeah.
You don't want to do that on every write. So just moving it onto the pin list, that means that it's amortized work, whatever. You're only going to examine that item once and get put on that pinned item. You won't have to iterate over it again. So that'll help a lot.
Yeah. One thing I do have to say with moving it the way that we did, though, where now we're not doing it in the mempool loop, is that at least we might be doing a ton more work every time, but at least now we'll be like more aggressively trying to get stuff like unpinned, right? So memory growth might be a little bit less with the current code than like what's in Luminous.
Yeah. Well, I think if you fix this thing that you're working on right now, then I think we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Awkward spot right now. Okay. That sounds good though. All right. Anything else? All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, bye.